The morning my father was buried, my stepmother smiled at me across the grave. Not a sad smile. Not even a polite one. It was the kind of smile that knows something you don't. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself grief does strange things to the mind. Makes you see cruelty where there is only distance. Makes you read malice into the way someone adjusts their veil or holds their program a little too loosely, like none of it really matters. I was wrong to tell myself that. My father had been sick for 3 years. I moved back into the house on Clearwater Drive when he was first diagnosed, gave up my apartment in Cincinnati, took a remote position at a medical billing company so I could be there when he needed help getting to appointments, when he couldn't manage the stairs on his own anymore, when the good days got shorter and the bad days started arriving in pairs. My stepmother, Diane, had been in his life for 11 years by then. She was pleasant enough in a surface-level way, the kind of woman who always remembered to send birthday cards but never actually showed up to the party. She and my father had no children together. I was his only daughter, from his first marriage, and she never let either of us forget the distinction. After he passed, the attorney handling the estate, a man named Gerald Foss, called us both in for a reading 4 days after the funeral. I remember sitting in that office thinking how surreal it was, how the leather chair felt too solid, too real, while everything else around me felt like it was made of smoke. Gerald read the will aloud in a flat, practiced voice. The house went to Diane. The savings accounts went to Diane. The investment portfolio my father had spent 30 years building Diane. My name appeared once, near the bottom, in a line that allocated me a small jewelry box and my mother's old rocking chair which had been sitting in the garage for years. I didn't speak during the reading. I couldn't. I kept waiting for Gerald to turn the page, to say, and furthermore, to tell me there had been a second document or a trust I hadn't known about. He didn't. He folded the papers, offered a tight professional smile, and that was that. Diane was already on her phone in the parking lot when I walked out. She was talking about the house, something about repainting the living room. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could make myself drive. I moved into a motel 3 days later. Diane hadn't asked me to leave. She didn't have to. She stopped refilling the coffee maker in the mornings, started scheduling contractors to come during the hours she knew I'd be home, let my mail pile up in a stack by the door without mentioning it. She was very good at making someone feel unwelcome, without saying a single word that could be used against her. It was a skill I recognized by then. She had been practicing it for years. The motel was on Route 9, the kind of place where the ice machine down the hall groans all night and the curtains never quite meet in the middle. I told myself it was temporary. I had a job, I had savings, I had a plan. What I didn't have was any understanding of why my father, a man who had spent his life telling me I was the most important thing in it, had left me with almost nothing. I found the answer 3 weeks later, inside a shoebox. I had gone back to the house while Diane was out to collect the last of my things from the garage. The rocking chair, a box of books, my mother's old Christmas ornaments. I was dragging a bin toward the door when I bumped a shelf and knocked down a plastic storage box that had been pushed all the way to the back, behind a set of rarely used golf clubs. The lid popped open when it hit the floor. Inside was the usual accumulation of forgotten things: old batteries, a broken watch, a flashlight that no longer worked. And underneath all of it, wedged flat against the bottom, was a small metal tin, the kind that used to hold shortbread cookies. I almost put it back. I almost left it on the shelf and walked out with my rocking chair and went on with my life. I opened it instead. Inside the tin was a folded piece of paper, a key on a small ring, and a plain white envelope sealed with a strip of tape. On the outside of the envelope, in my father's handwriting, unmistakably his, the slightly uneven capital letters, the way he always pressed too hard with a pen he had written 2 words. For Sophia. My hands were shaking before I finished reading my own name. I sat down on the garage floor right there, between the golf clubs and the recycling bins, and I opened the envelope first. "My girl," it began. "If you found this, then things went the way I feared they might. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you better while I was here to do it, but I tried to protect you for after. The key in the tin opens a safe deposit box at Meridian Trust Bank, the branch on Callaway Street. Box number 447. The account is in your name only. It has been since you were 19. I set it up the year Diane and I got married, because I wanted to make sure that no matter what happened, you would have something that was yours, and only yours. I didn't tell you about it because I was afraid that if you knew, she would find out. She watches things, Sophia. She always has. There are documents in the box that explain everything. I love you more than I've ever been good at saying. Please use what I've left you to build the life you deserve. Dad. I read the letter 4 times. Then I sat in the garage for a long time, just breathing. The key was small and ordinary looking, brass-colored, with a number stamped into the head. It didn't look like anything important. It looked like the kind of key you find in a junk drawer and spend months trying to remember what it opens. I closed my fingers around it and it was warm, like it had been waiting. I drove to Meridian Trust the next morning. The branch on Callaway was a smaller building than I expected, tucked between a dry cleaner and an insurance office, with frosted glass windows and a dark green awning. I sat in my car across the street for a few minutes, the key in my palm, running through every possible outcome. Maybe the box was empty. Maybe my father had meant to do something with it and never got around to it. Maybe this was the part where I found out his intentions were good and his follow-through was not. I went in anyway. The woman at the front desk was young, professional, with reading glasses pushed up on her head that she hadn't seemed to notice were there. I told her I needed to access a safe deposit box and gave her my ID and the box number. She typed something, looked at the screen, and her expression shifted in a way she tried to make neutral. She excused herself and came back 2 minutes later with a man in a dark blazer who introduced himself as the branch manager, a man named Thomas Wyatt. Thomas asked me to follow him. We went to a private room in the back, not the vault itself, but a small office with a table and 2 chairs and no windows. He sat across from me, and he had a folder in his hands. He opened it without looking at me, reviewed something on the page, then looked up. "Miss Callaway," he said, "before we proceed, I want you to know that this account has special access protocols attached to it. Your father was very specific about the instructions." I told him I knew almost nothing about the account. I explained that my father had just passed, that I'd found a letter and a key. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He called us, actually, about 8 months ago. When he knew his condition was progressing, he wanted to make sure everything was in order for you." 8 months ago. My father had been in the hospital twice in those 8 months. I had sat beside his bed and held his hand and read to him from the mystery novels he liked, and not once had he mentioned any of this. He had kept it from me all the way to the end. Not out of carelessness. Out of care. Thomas reached across the table and placed a piece of paper in front of me. He turned it so I could read it right side up. At the top, it said, "Account Summary Sophia Renee Callaway." Below that were numbers that I read, and then immediately read again because my brain refused to process them on the first pass. "That can't be right," I said. Thomas said, "It is." The account held just over $4 million in liquid assets. In addition to that, the safe deposit box contained documentation for 2 pieces of commercial property. My father owned outright a small office building in Dayton and a warehouse space that had been leased to the same tenant for 11 years. It also held the deed to a parcel of land outside the city that my grandfather had originally purchased in the 1970s and that my father had quietly transferred into a trust in my name 12 years ago. He was very careful, Thomas said, and his voice was quiet in the way that people's voices get when they're in the presence of something that moves them. Every few years he'd come in and update the documentation, make sure everything was current, legally sound. He retained an attorney, a woman named Patricia Gould, specifically to manage the trust. "She's been expecting to hear from you." My father had retained an attorney. Specifically for me. Specifically for this. He thought, Thomas said carefully, that there might be a challenge to the estate after he was gone. He wanted to make sure you were protected in advance. I looked at the paper in front of me. $4 million, 2 commercial properties, a parcel of land, and my father, in the last years of his life, quietly building a wall around all of it to make sure no one could take it from me. "My stepmother," I said. "Did she know about any of this?" Thomas shook his head. This account was never part of the marital estate. Your father was very clear about keeping it entirely separate. Mrs. Diane Calloway has no legal claim to any of it. There was a long pause. Outside the closed door, I could hear the ordinary sounds of a bank keyboards, a phone ringing, someone's muffled conversation. Normal life going on in the next room while mine shifted completely on its axis. "There's one more thing," Thomas said. He stood and excused himself for a moment, returning with a padded envelope that had my name written across the front in my father's handwriting. "He asked us to hold this for you as well." I took it with both hands. Inside the safe deposit box, after Thomas had escorted me to the vault and left me alone with it, I found what he had told me I would: the property documents, the trust paperwork, a sealed letter from Patricia Gould with her contact information. But I also found something Thomas hadn't mentioned. Something my father must have added quietly on one of his visits when no one was paying close attention. It was a small journal, the kind with a cloth cover, maybe 40 pages long. My father's handwriting filled most of them. He had written down everything. Not as a legal document. Not as evidence. Just as a record, written for me, in the careful and slightly formal way he had always written things, because he never quite trusted himself to say the difficult things out loud. He wrote about marrying Diane. About the early years when things were fine, when she was warm and he was happy, and he believed it was going to work. He wrote about the slow change, the way she began managing his friendships, his time, his access to me after I went to college. He wrote about the phone calls she would intercept or fail to mention, the visits she would discourage by scheduling things on top of them, the way she spoke about me when she thought he wasn't listening closely. He wrote, "I know she tells people Sophia is difficult. Sophia is not difficult. Sophia is the easiest person I have ever loved. She asks for nothing and gives everything. I don't know how to tell her that I see what Diane does without making things worse." He wrote, "I think she has always been waiting for me to get sick. I don't say this to be cruel. I say it because it is the truth, and I have run out of time for anything but the truth." He wrote, "I asked her once, near the beginning, what she would do if something happened to me. She talked about the house for 20 minutes and never once mentioned Sophia. That was when I started planning. I sat in that small vault room for a long time. The chair was hard and the light was fluorescent and my face was wet and I didn't care about any of it. I was sitting with my father's handwriting, reading things he had never been able to say to me, and it was both the worst and the best I had felt since he died. He hadn't forgotten me. He hadn't been too weak or too tired or too controlled to act. He had simply been quiet about it, the way he was quiet about everything that mattered most, and underneath the quiet he had built something solid. Patricia Gould's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, all glass and clean lines. The kind of office that tells you before you sit down that the person behind the desk is very good at what they do. She was in her mid-50s, silver-haired. With reading glasses she actually wore on her face rather than pushed up on her head. She stood when I came in, shook my hand, and got directly to the point in the way of someone who has learned that dragging things out rarely helps anyone. She had been my father's attorney for 13 years. She had helped him structure the trust, the property holdings, the account at Meridian. She had advised him on how to keep everything separate from the marital estate, in a way that was completely legal and completely invisible to anyone who didn't already know where to look. "Your stepmother's attorneys may come looking," Patricia said. She said it the way a doctor tells you a side effect calmly, without drama, because the information is more useful than the alarm. Not because she has any legal grounds. She doesn't. But people who expect to inherit things, and then discover they haven't, sometimes look for ways to create grounds where none exist. I thought about Diane's smile across the grave. What do they usually do? Contest the competency of the deceased at the time the trust was established. Claim undue influence. Allege the documents are fraudulent. Patricia folded her hands on the desk. None of those arguments will succeed in this case. Your father was meticulous. 13 years of documentation. Multiple independent attorney reviews. Medical records from the period of establishment confirming full cognitive capacity, signed, witnessed, notarized at every stage. She paused. He was preparing for exactly this. He had been preparing for 13 years. I thought about all the Sunday afternoon phone calls, the visits where he seemed distracted, the times he'd asked questions about my life that felt oddly specific, where I was working, whether I had savings, whether I was happy. I had thought he was just being a father. He was being a father, but he was also doing something else. He was checking in on a plan. "There's one more thing," Patricia said, and something in her tone made me go still. She opened a drawer and placed a thin folder on the desk between us. "3 months before he passed, your father asked me to compile something. He called it a record of concern." Inside the folder were printed copies of emails, text messages, financial records, a transcript from a meeting with a financial advisor that Diane had apparently attended alone 2 years before my father died, in which she had discussed his estate as though she were already managing it. A note from his doctor, also compiled at his request, documenting that Diane had twice attempted to attend private medical consultations without his permission. "She tried to have his mail redirected to a P.O. box she controlled," Patricia said. "He caught it, had it reversed, and asked me to document it." The folder was thin, but it was thorough. My father had been watching, quietly, carefully, for a very long time. "He wanted you to have this," Patricia said. "Not necessarily to use, just to know." He said she checked a note. He said, "I don't want her to wonder. I don't want her to spend years thinking she misread things. I want her to know clearly what she was dealing with, so she can decide what to do from a position of truth rather than doubt." I pressed my fingers flat against the table to keep them from shaking. He knew me. Even at the end, even through everything, he knew exactly what would haunt me most. Not the loss of the money, not the legal complexity, but the uncertainty. The possibility that I had imagined it. That Diane had simply been a normal person, and I had been an uncharitable daughter-in-law who read malice into ordinary behavior. He had removed that possibility. He had given me evidence not as a weapon, but as a gift. "What do I do now?" I asked. Patricia looked at me the way people look at someone who has just come through something difficult and is only now beginning to understand what they survived. "You protect what's yours," she said, "and you build." The call from Diane came 9 days later. I had been staying in a new apartment by then, a proper one, not the Route 9 motel. I had used some of the liquid assets to pay a security deposit, and 3 months in advance, because Patricia had advised me to establish a stable address before anything else. The apartment was small and had a radiator that knocked in the middle of the night, but the lease was in my name and the key was mine, and I slept better in it than I had slept anywhere in months. When the call came, I almost didn't answer. Unknown number, which since my father died had started to feel like a warning. But I answered, and it was Diane. She asked how I was. She said she'd been thinking about me. She said she was sorry we hadn't had more time to talk after the funeral, that things had been so hectic, that she hoped I understood. I said I understood. She said she had been going through some of my father's papers and had come across references to a bank account she wasn't familiar with. She asked if I knew anything about it. My pulse spiked, but my voice stayed level. I told her I didn't know what she was referring to. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Sophia, we're family. If there's something your father set aside, we should handle it together, as a family, don't you think?" I told her I'd have my attorney reach out if there was anything to discuss. Then I ended the call and immediately forwarded the recording to Patricia. I had been recording all my calls since the day I found the tin in the garage. Patricia had suggested it. I had been glad, every day since, that I'd listened. Patricia called me back within the hour. "She's fishing," she said. "She doesn't know what she's looking for. She's hoping you'll volunteer something." A pause. "She's also, based on that call, almost certainly working with someone who's told her there may be additional assets. Don't speak to her again without me present." There was someone helping her. Someone who knew enough to send her looking. Patricia launched an inquiry through the bank. 2 weeks later, we had a name. A junior accounts officer at Meridian. A man who had worked there for 4 years and who had apparently, at some point, been approached by someone who knew what questions to ask. He denied sharing any specific account details, but the investigation found that he had confirmed the existence of the account when he shouldn't have, not the balance, not the specifics, but enough to point someone in the right direction. He was terminated. The bank issued a formal apology. Patricia added it to the file. Diane's attorneys made their first formal move 6 weeks after the funeral. They filed a motion contesting the validity of the trust, alleging that my father had been experiencing cognitive decline at the time the most recent trust amendments were made. Amendments, Patricia noted dryly, that were made 4 years ago, when my father was 61 years old, fully employed, and had received a clean cognitive screening from his neurologist 6 months prior. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning. Patricia came with a binder that was almost 2 inches thick. She was calm the entire time, the way someone is calm when they have prepared for so long that they have used up all their anxiety in advance. Diane sat across the aisle with 2 attorneys, and a woman I didn't recognize who I later learned was a forensic financial consultant they had hired to review my father's estate records. She looked at me when I came in. Not with the graveyard smile this time. With something harder to read. The judge was a woman in her late 60s, reading glasses on a beaded chain. She gave the impression of someone who had heard every version of this argument and was prepared to be unimpressed by all of them. Patricia presented the competency records first, then the original trust documents, each with independent witness signatures and notarizations. Then the attorney review logs each time the trust had been updated. A separate estate attorney had reviewed and signed off. Then the letter from my father's neurologist. Then the letter from his primary care physician. Then the journal, which Patricia had had authenticated, and which she submitted not as legal evidence but as a supplementary document, to provide context for the intent behind the trust. The judge read several pages of the journal. She did not rush. Diane's lead attorney argued that the trust had been structured to deliberately exclude a spouse, which was, he said, evidence of undue influence. Someone must have convinced my father to do this against his nature and his wishes. Patricia asked the judge to consider that my father had maintained and updated this trust for 13 years, through 2 sets of attorneys, across 4 separate documented reviews, all of which reflected consistent and coherent intent. She said that if someone had applied undue influence for 13 consecutive years without leaving a single inconsistency in the legal record, the bar for what constituted undue was perhaps worth reconsidering. The judge made a sound that might have been the beginning of a smile. The motion was denied. Diane's attorney immediately filed a notice of intent to appeal. The judge acknowledged it and set a timeline. Then she looked at Patricia and said that if the appeal proceeded on the same evidentiary basis, she would recommend sanctions for frivolous litigation. We walked out of the courthouse into November air, cold and bright. Patricia put her binder under her arm and said, "That's the worst they can do. The appeal will go nowhere." I asked if she was sure. "Your father made sure," she said. 13 years ago. That's how sure. I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment. Somewhere behind me, Diane and her attorneys were having a conversation I couldn't hear. In front of me, the city went on being ordinary, cabs and cyclists and people on lunch breaks, none of whom knew that anything had just happened. I thought about my father at 61, walking into Patricia's office and asking her to help him make something that couldn't be broken. I thought about him at 64, in the hospital, still updating documents, still making sure. I thought about him 3 weeks before he died, writing in the cloth-covered journal in his careful, too-hard handwriting, leaving me a record not of what had happened but of how clearly he had seen it. I took out my phone and called my oldest friend, a woman named Jules, who had been asking me every 3 days if I was okay and accepting my reassurances with obvious skepticism. When she answered, I said, "I'm okay, actually okay." There was a pause and then she said, "I'm coming over, don't argue." She brought food and stayed until midnight, which was what I needed, and somewhere in the middle of it I started talking, really talking, the way I hadn't been able to since my father died, and Jules sat on my new couch in my apartment that no one could make me leave, and she listened to all of it. The appeal was dismissed 4 months later on procedural grounds. Patricia called to tell me, and then told me she was done unless I needed her, which was her way of saying it was over. I thanked her, and she said my father had been easy to work for, by which I understood her to mean that he had been a good man. I kept the commercial properties, I hired a property management company to handle the day-to-day so I could keep my remote job, which I had discovered I actually liked. I visited the land outside the city on a Saturday in March, drove out on a 2-lane road through fields that were just beginning to show green, parked on the gravel shoulder, and walked the boundary of it in boots that got muddy. My grandfather had bought that land when he was 40 years old. My father had transferred it to me when I was 19. Between the two of them, it had been held in trust for me for more than half my lifetime, without my knowledge, a quiet fact waiting for the right moment to become known. I stood in the middle of it for a while, just standing. A hawk circled somewhere overhead. The wind moved through the grass in long, slow waves. I didn't have a plan for it yet. That was okay. There was time now, which was the thing I had been least expecting to find on the other side of all of this. Not the money, not the properties, not even the legal victory, but time, space, room to think about what I actually wanted instead of only what I needed to survive. I went back to the car. I sat in the driver's seat, and the sun came through the windshield at an angle that made everything warm and a little golden. The way early spring light does when it's trying to remind you that it's still there, that it didn't go anywhere while you weren't looking. I thought about my father writing, "Use what I've left you to build the life you deserve." I hadn't known, when I read it the first time, what that life looked like. I still didn't know. Exactly. But for the first time in a very long time, I felt the shape of it starting to form. Not something I was building toward out of fear, not something I was holding together with both hands while everything else fell apart, but something I was actually choosing. That felt different. That felt like the beginning. If you've stayed with me through all of this, thank you, truly. I know it was a lot to carry. And if any part of my story felt familiar, if you've ever been made to feel like you were the problem, like you were difficult, like you were less than what you knew you were, I hope this reminds you that sometimes the people who love us most are working harder on our behalf than we ever get to see. And sometimes, eventually, we find out. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if this story meant something to you, I'd love for you to stay.